So in 1978, you wrote the book "The International Man," and this book, it's the subtitle is a complete guidebook to the world's last frontiers for freedom seekers, investors, adventurers, speculators, and expatriates. You've lived all over the world. You've been to most of the countries of the world, and I think in the chaotic time that we're experiencing right now, people are wondering. I certainly was like, where's a safe haven? Where's a safe haven for your assets? But even more than that, with some of these riots and things like that happening, you really wonder for your personal safety. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. Like looking back, obviously decades and decades after you originally wrote the original book, what are your thoughts today on where one can achieve the greatest freedom?
Yeah, right. Well, to start with, most people are glued to the environment where they're born. They're like plants. They're born someplace. They grow up, grade school, high school there, natural. That they'll maybe even go to a local college, get a local job, buy a local house, stay in that house for their whole lives. If they do well, maybe get a bigger one. But they're not very internationally oriented. It's a big deal if they take a trip to Europe once in their life. Things have changed, of course, but still, my basic outlook on this is it's not a good survival strategy for a human being to act like you're a plant rooted in one place. There are advantages to doing that. It's easier, certainly, but I don't think it's smart. So I wrote this book in 1978 to basically explore this philosophy. And it was a surprisingly good selling book because there was nothing on the market in those days that covered the ground that The International Man did back then. Oddly, that book became the largest selling book in the history of Rhodesia. Little known fact, because I went to Rhodesia during the war. I really do like going to war zones for lots of reasons we could talk about. And opened up the Salisbury, that was the name of Harare at the time, opened up the Yellow Pages, and believe it or not, there were two publishers listed there. I always went through the Yellow Pages of these cities just to see who was there and what they were doing and who I might want to talk to. And I had a whole drill about this when I get into a place that I'd never been to before. That always led to very interesting experiences. Anyway, when I went there, the book had been pretty recently published. So I interviewed these two publishers, got along very well with one of them. And when I came back the next time, this is in the middle of the war, and it was really quite dicey and interesting because it was an actual race war going on. So anyway, it was Gordon Graham, and Gordon printed up a bunch of these books, and they sold like hotcakes because at that point, still, there were probably about 250,000 Europeans or people of European extraction living in Rhodesia. And at that time, there were probably only about 3 or 4 million natives who were basically one of two tribes. I'm trying to remember what the two tribes are, actually. Anyway, this book flew off the shelves. I mean, so it became the best-selling book in the history of the country. Everybody who wanted to make the chicken run needed a copy of that book because they were all pretty isolated, these people. And now, if you go back to Zim, you'll find that it's hard to say, but there's out of the 250,000 whites that were there, there can't be more than a couple or 3,000 left, tops.
Wow.
Tops. So that kind of showed the value of having a kind of a backup plan when things go badly in your native country. And people think, well, this is the United States. Things will never go badly here. And yeah, there certainly has always been some reason for that because like we talked about before, in many ways, the U.S. is the exceptional country uh, because of the way it was founded and all kinds of reasons that we talked about the other day. So it seemed like an international backup plan, an escape hatch, wasn't necessary. It would be redundant. I'm not sure that's the case anymore. In fact, I'm pretty sure it isn't the case anymore because now the
Right.
U.S. It's become just another country.
Yeah, and also I think that the this isn't obviously in like the times where you had the war going on in Rhodesia, which caused incredible turmoil. But people, Americans who had gone their entire life without being exposed to any serious social unrest or any riots. I mean, for me, I do remember the Rodney King riot. But that was just an LA thing. It was really limited to that, and that in my lifetime it's the only one that I'm aware of. I'm not saying others didn't happen in the U.S. in my lifetime, but there's not any that I have a memory of any kind. And now all of a sudden, millions of Americans have had to confront the idea that there's something not too terribly far away from them that is happening, that in neighborhoods that they know well, where there's this just sort of wanton destruction occurring. And so I think that recognition that there might be a need to change the way you're doing things, or to think about the world, its safety and its risks in a different way. I think that's there now. I think it's there. And
Yeah.
so
Oh, I agree. Uh, and a lot of people don't. Well, actually, the Rodney King riots, that was very serious for LA, but it didn't spread out of LA, you're right. But in between roughly 1968 and 1972, um, I was pretty active, not in the riots, but, I was living in Washington, D.C. In those days. And there were about 4,000 bombings. I think that's the correct number in the U.S. During that time period. That's a lot. A lot of them were just Molotov cocktails, but a Molotov cocktail is a really effective bomb. I mean, arson is it's more dangerous than explosives most of the time. 4,000, and there were riots all over the country then, especially in Washington, D.C. I lived in Georgetown for part of that time, and I could see the flames going up in other parts. It was a hotbed. It was risky. It was dangerous.
mm,
Although in Georgetown it was pretty safe because the black people who were doing the rioting and burning down their own houses, which was really kind of stupid and funny actually, they never thought of coming into Georgetown. But things are different, very, very different now, and much more serious than they were then, because the U.S. was still at the top of its game. And now we're clearly in decline economically and a lot of other ways too. So yeah, I think you better get a second passport, a second citizenship,
mm,
because a lot of Americans, in fact, I think almost all Americans are unaware of the fact that if you were accused, not adjudicated, but accused by the IRS of owing $50,000 or more in taxes, they will cancel your passport, and you're not going anywhere. That's really serious. That's the type of thing that used to happen in the Iron Curtain, where you weren't allowed to leave the country for a decade.
and even just during the it's amazing to see during the COVID hysteria, all of the all of the passport controls that have popped up, and all of a sudden the U.S. passport, which was a great passport, which could you could travel visa free almost anywhere. All of a sudden, the number of countries you could travel easily to went from well over 120 or so all down to 30, all
Hmm.
overnight almost.
Actually, visa-free or visa on entry. Oh, it's more than that. It went from about 160, which is
Mm.
almost all of the world's countries, because for these purposes, they say there's 193 countries in the world. It's gone down to like 20 now. So I can go to Northern Macedonia, I can go to Albania, and a few other places like that now. But you can't go to Europe even if you have a U.S. passport. It's insane.
Yeah, we were scheduled to take an Atlas trip to Iceland in October, but that's been canceled.
Incidentally, the first time I went to Iceland, I went there on my United Services, on my World Service Authority passport. Uh,
You did?
this is true. Uh, there was a guy talking about international diversification and things like that, and why you should be more than just a card-carrying American. Gary Davis was a bomber pilot during World War II, and he was the son of a very famous band leader at that era named Meyer Davis. So anyway, after the war, Gary was fed up with all this, and he was kind of a famous guy because of his father. He burned his U.S. passport on the steps of some important building in Paris. I forget where. It was a big deal. But then he found, now that he had no U.S. passport, he couldn't leave France. So he was a clever guy. And what he did was he got a hold of a UN passport, saw the way it looked and was written, and minted up his own passport. Called his organization the World Service Authority, quoted from the UN Charter. A very good-looking document, I gotta say. So I sent $100 in, got one, and I used it. And first place, now this is a homemade identification document, okay? Homemade, nice looking, but homemade. And I used it, where did I use it? I used it in Peru the next year, stayed there for a week. I used it in Honduras twice, Costa Rica, which is more or less a real country. Where else did I use that thing? And Iceland, which I thought was interesting. French Polynesia, I used it there. And I was getting quite used to it. Of course, there are some places where I was turned away, but now, because all the countries of the world, their passports, they're all computerized, they're all hooked up, and a World Service Authority passport is only good for giving to a casino when they want identification, or in a hotel where they want to collect your passport, which they do in a lot of countries.
Yep.
But so the world's tightened up a lot. It really has.
So having a second passport gives you options beyond necessarily just the IRS angle. It's also could potentially allow you to have free travel to a country that is temporarily blocked off to Americans because of health concerns or something else. I think that's something that I didn't imagine, but seems obvious at this point. And who knows how those are going to be. It seems to me we have experienced peak travel where, at least for my lifetime, and I could be wrong, of course, but I believe that it'll probably never in my lifetime be as accessible and inexpensive as it has been over the last decade.
I think you're quite correct, because now, in addition to having your papers in order with the national passport and visas, you're going to have a COVID passport, it would seem. They're talking about this, so it's going to be a third type of thing that you're going to need.
Right.
Yeah, it's true. And of course, the airlines, that's a problematical business. Warren Buffett is famous for saying that the world's investors would have been much better off if somebody shot down Orville when he took off on his first. Airlines have just been a black hole for capital. They've been making money in recent years until this recent disaster.
And Warren Buffett became a big investor in them. Buffett became a big investor in them at the top, essentially, and then lost a bunch of money as he sold all of his interests in all the airlines, essentially after COVID hit. So he finally went back on his long-term rule, essentially bought the airlines and then lost handily. So.
Yeah, it seems like Buffett's been breaking a lot of his long-term rules. He never used to buy a tech stock, and now his largest single holding is Apple, and he's got a whole bunch of other things like that. He used to believe, quite correctly incidentally, in the old saying, high tech, big wreck. They go way up and then they crash as a a new technology comes along or somebody does the current technology better, whatever. It's not like a business where you can build a moat around yourself. So
Right.
same thing will happen again.
Well, so
But that
if people want to learn about second passports, they can go to internationalman.com, and you guys talk about some of the different opportunities that are available for acquiring second passports.
Yeah, we do. And you can actually purchase citizenship with the accompanying passport from, I guess it's about 10 countries in the world today, most of them in the Caribbean. And at some point I could talk about how I think it was my idea that this whole industry of selling passports started. Kind of an interesting anecdotal story, but not appropriate at this particular moment to.
Yeah, I've heard it, and I think everybody would get a big kick out of it. So we should talk about that at some point. I wonder now, though. So there are, like you said, 10 or a dozen countries that make the passports available in this way. There's also different, you can get it through residency, and there's other ways you can acquire foreign passports. But I think one of the big questions that I think most people would have is where to go, because most people are not nearly as well traveled as you are, or even as well traveled as I am. They don't even know where would be safe. How would you even understand what does it mean for a country to be safe? What are the characteristics that might make it safe and freedom oriented and be better than where they are today? I think it's the unknown that keeps most people potted plants their whole life. So at least knowing how to evaluate the countries or other jurisdictions would be helpful.
Well, of course, you can always just go across the border to Canada. And during the Vietnam War, there were many thousands of guys that did that and subsequently became Canadian citizens. So, Canada's easy. Canada's kind of a people's republic these days, but that'll work. But where would I go if I wanted to set up a second residence? There's all kinds of reasons to do this, incidentally. Yeah. And people think, well, New Zealand, that's nice. Everybody's seen Lord of the Rings, and it was filmed in New Zealand, the ideal place for a family. Beautiful, nice weather. I lived in New Zealand for, God, years in New Zealand. It was delightful. But if I was a guy, and I don't know what age most of our listeners and viewers might be, but certainly if I was under 30 today and I was looking to make my fortune, I would not stay here in the US just for economic reasons. Why? Because if you're a guy, smart, got an education, and so forth, there's millions like you here in the US. You're on a level playing field, more or less. I don't like level playing fields. I like playing fields that are tilted way in my favor. So how are you going to take advantage of the fact that you're an American with you've got more education, you got more money, you got more experience, you got more connections, you got a certain cachet, at least in many places, by virtue of being an American. How are you going to take advantage of that? These are big advantages that most people never play to. They don't play to their strong suit. I would go to Africa today. People say, Africa, that's crazy. Well, it's not crazy. There's 54 countries on the continent. It's known for violence and instability. Didn't used to be that way, incidentally. One fellow he's dead now, but he was a friend of mine. He was the first U.S. ambassador to the Congo, Claire Timberlake. I spent some time with him, and he said he was very familiar with Africa as the first American ambassador to the Congo. And he said, look, during the 50s, I would have let my teenage daughter hitchhike anywhere on the continent, and I knew she'd be perfectly safe. But Africa's not like that today. Of course, I could talk about Haiti. I used to go to Haiti when Papa Doc was there, and it was probably the safest country in the world. Now, Port-au-Prince is I'd say it's the most dangerous city in the world. but different story. Uh, so
So for younger people, if you're basically trying to make your fortune, it's really kind of understanding the world as a market, and that, you know, supply and demand, and where you are, where you're amongst a very large supply of, you know, energetic, educated, wealthy by world standards, by global standards. Here in the US, you don't stand out much, but by moving yourself to a place where, you know, the supply of you is very limited, there are people like you, then you can stand out from the crowd. And I noticed this just in my little time that I lived in Argentina, that it was, uh, opportunities were presented to me that never would have been presented to me in a norm, you know, in the United States. The people that I interacted with, the people that I met, the people that I was introduced to subsequently by the people I met, were all of, you know, more of an elite caste, I guess, almost, within Argentina. And, you know, I mean, I'm a, you know, Midwestern kid from Iowa who's, you know, very, very, you know, at the median in most things here in the U.S. But in Argentina, I did feel like a unique and special snowflake because I was in that higher demand category. And I think my experience with that is absolutely right. And I think people don't see that until they actually venture outside of the U.S. and see how opportunities just get presented totally differently to them.
yes, they're trapped by preconceptions and fear. They hear that they're like medieval peasants. They've heard stories that there might be dragons over that hill. Uh, Dangerous. Better not go there. Better stay here where you know it's kind of safe. It's ridiculous. No, if I was under 30 and wanted to make my fortune, I would fly to pick your city. I mean, it depends on whether you want to jump in onto the shallow end of the pool or the deep end of the pool. Usually it's better to take these things on a gradient and kind of groove into them. But in most of these countries, if you present well, and if you have the right things to say, and if you've thought a few things out, I promise you, you could be sitting down, if not with the president of the country, at least with one of the ministers, and stepping up from there within a month. I've done it in a week. So, and of course, you can talk to any businessman in the country, and who knows what you could bring to the party that they don't know about, they've never heard about. No, so I don't have much sympathy for these people that are living in their mother's basements saying, oh, woe is me.
Right.
Borrow a couple $1,000 from somebody and do it.
Right. And I think, you know, I think that you had an international man, you had four major categories where you said that, again, people should look at beyond the U.S. borders. And I think in one of them, we've been talking to the second one, opportunity a lot. And I think especially for younger people, when you literally have nothing to lose in your 20s. I mean, this is the time for accumulating something that I read about in this book once. It was called identity capital. It's just, you know, you can't actually, you don't have a lot of capital yourself, but you build experiences, relationships, and skills that basically you can then leverage in your 30s and 40s and beyond. And, you know, with so little to lose, your 20s is definitely makes a ton of sense to do it. And especially now when, I mean, the move to remote work was already underway, where a lot of people were able to work from anywhere in the world already. But now I think the stigma that goes with, you know, people being a remote employee or a remote contractor is almost completely gone, simply because, you know, everybody's been forced to work remote if they could in the era of COVID.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So, I mean, actually, the only things that you really own are the experiences that you had and the skills that you've learned and the knowledge that you have. Everything else is up for grabs. You can lose everything else in a New York second. So that's why, you know, when you're a kid or in your 20s or even early 30s, certainly, you should just be a sponge and go places where you can get all the connections and skills and knowledge that you can. You stay in one place, uh, it's just a big mistake. And in addition to that, it's adventure. Frankly, I mean, the fact of the matter is that the second law of thermodynamics rules the world. And what is the second law of thermodynamics? It's a tendency of everything to fall apart and wind down. And that happens to include the human body. And the fact of the matter is, you can do stuff when you're in your 20s. You can't do so much in your 30s. It's harder in your 40s. By the time you get to your 50s, you can start forgetting about it, you know?
Yep.
So you got to do these things while you're young. There's no time like the present to do this.
I agree. So now we talked about opportunity and adventure, and specifically for people, younger people, those things seem to be, I think they're critical. I think for people that are more, in my age group and older, people that have children, and probably one of my biggest concerns is about making sure that my kids grow up in an environment where they are unmolested by the crime or anything else, actually, but mostly crime. I don't want them really, or even blight. I don't really want them exposed to that if I can help it. I'd rather them be able to. I mean, there's a lot that you can learn being in difficult circumstances, of course, but I mean, I of course, as a parent, I want my kids to grow up in an environment where they don't have to worry about being assaulted on their way to school, or or whatever. So the other two, so you had opportunity and adventure we talked about. For freedom and hedging your bets, how should people think about that? Where is the place in the world where you can find freedom today?
Well, that is always changing, and it always has been changing. I mean, I like to point out that the world can change radically quickly. I mean, Russia before 1917 was a totally different place than it was 5 years later. And it got worse from there. And Germany, one of the most civilized countries in the world. And then in 1933, it changed overnight. And incidentally, by popular election, because Adolf was popularly elected. It was a plurality, but most elections are won by pluralities. Lincoln won by a plurality, about the same size as that Hitler won by. So things can change instantly, overnight. I mean, in China it was chaos, but then it got really bad after Mao. Almost every country in the world has gone through these horrible periods. So that thinking that the world isn't going to change is really just foolish and naive. So you owe it to yourself to have a crib someplace else. And not only will you be broadening your horizons and your opportunities and perhaps radically reducing your standard of living as well as increasing your income, but things are actually changing here in the U.S. and very rapidly. I remember when Kurt Saxon, his wife is Goldie Hawn. What's Kurt's?
Russell.
Kurt Russell. Yeah, when he did that movie, Escape from New York, it was fun sci-fi, but could that actually happen to New York? It seems incredible, unbelievable. But, if you'd asked a German in 1939, what's Berlin going to look like in 1946? He wouldn't have believed it. Would have been a smoking ruin. Anything can happen. So
you got to hedge your bets. You got to hedge your bets.
You got to hedge your bets.
And, there's, of course, I think that one of the ways that you see this trend in the U.S. of people hedging their bets is just moving from New York or from other urban centers into, places that are more rural. You see the property values around New York City going up dramatically. Meanwhile, the vacancy rate in New York City itself is higher than it's been in a long, long time. And so you see people kind of doing that kind of even in the US alone, doing these things to hedge their bets. And I think that trend, do you think this trend from urban to suburban or rural is something that's going to stick? Do you think it's going to last?
Yeah, it's that's a very good question, because you've got to look at the megatrends. And the megatrend of where population has been going for not just years or decades, but actually for centuries, has been out of the countryside and into the cities. This has been going on for centuries. And if you look at China, where everything is like on fast forward, it went from like a almost entirely agrarian country back in 1980, when they were just peasants with ox carts in the fields, to now they all live in giant cities of 5 million population cities, are dime a dozen, literally, in China. There's hundreds of them, perhaps. It's unbelievable. 10 million population cities, and they're still moving into the cities. So this is a long-term trend. Well, why is the trend going to change? Will it change? Certainly in the United States, I think it is changing, and it's changing because of electronic technology, among other things. I mean, there are a lot of advantages to being in a city. We like the restaurants. We like the convenience of walking to the store and seeing
opportunities usually are substantially better as well. You know, the economic opportunities are greater. Yeah.
If you're in a small town, I mean, what are you going to do if you're
gas station?
Yeah, but that might change because of things like Zoom and Skype, and yeah, it's more pleasant living in the country. I'm in the country right now, kind of in the middle of nowhere, and I think I like it a lot more than being in the city, especially since now in the city there are no advantages to it. I mean, the cities are what's locked down.
Right.
So the question is the trend going to change? And the cities are becoming dangerous. I think for the next 10 years, there's going to be a lot of violence and upset, because the Greater Depression has really just barely started. And when people find that even if they're employed, their income and their real standard of living is dropping, they're going to look for political solutions, and they're going to go in the streets and protest and riot. And that's not going to happen if you're in a stable, small community. So yeah, I think it's still early in the trend, but do it. Get out of New York and go to Aspen if you can afford it. But that's another question.
Right, that is. Well, but so that's a big trend that's happening, and I mean, it seemed like the trend to urbanization was driven, or at least turbocharged, by the Industrial Revolution, and it seems like there has to be some long-term economic advantage to being, to reverse the urbanization. Like there has to be some larger economic trend that's empowered by people not being there. You know what I mean? It seems like it was for economic reasons is what drove people into cities. And it seems like crime and disorder alone probably won't be enough to do it, I guess. But economic reasons, like maybe high taxes or really punitive, governments, I guess, could essentially provide that artificial economic incentive to get out of cities.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, why, since New York is turned into a hellhole, I hope it recovers, and it will to some degree, I think. But why go to New York when the advantages of being there have ceased to exist, and you have 10% sales tax, you've got every kind of tax, every kind of license, the state, not just the city, but then the state and the city income tax you've got to pay, which are no longer deductible, which is a good thing, against your federal income tax, and all the costs are much higher. So why go to New York anymore?
Yeah. Yeah.
Same with other big cities. It's similar. It's similar almost every place, frankly.
What about, so just, I just want to go back one more time and try and see what your thoughts are on the freedom one, because I think that the idea years ago when I first met you about living in a place internationally is that like even living in Argentina, which is a basket case country and has all kinds of problems, and yet you could live there in a way freer than you ever could in the U.S. because of the weak government, and you were sort of insulated from any crime or any of the local any Argentine nonsense, I guess. So you're able to isolate yourself from any of the problems, and yet reap many of the advantages of being in a
Oh,
place like that.
excellent point, Matt, because frankly, when you're a foreigner, especially a foreigner with at least some kind of means in one of these countries, you're treated as a guest to be cultivated because you can leave overnight. But while you're there, you're eating in restaurants and you're renting a place, so you're a benefit. They want you to be there. They try to cultivate a tourist industry if you look like a tourist. But if you stay in your home country, you're treated as an asset by the government. You're something to tax and something to be bossed around. And no, you're much freer if you're a tourist, or at least perceived as a tourist in the country where you might be living in. Oh, it's so much. The cops let you skate if you make a mistake, the way they wouldn't let a citizen. Oh no, it's much freer, And people say, well, I don't speak the language. Well, when you were a kid of 2 years old, you learned a language. You can actually do it again. And the fact is that even on this language problem, most of the people that you're likely to want to talk to already speak excellent English. So you can be lazy and not even learn the language. Since you're a native English speaker, you'll be fine.
That's true.
But,
I know when I was
but
in
it's tough
Argentina,
to learn the language.
yeah, it's not that hard, but you're right. It's harder than you would expect because everybody I was running into when I lived in Argentina was using me as an opportunity to practice their English.
Yeah,
So
so it made it hard for you to learn Spanish because they wouldn't
exactly,
let you do it.
exactly.
It's true.
So
It's true.
it's surprising. It really is much easier. It's pretty easy to get around the world as an English speaker. I mean, you want to talk about privilege? That's a huge privilege that basically because of for economic reasons and the dollar reason, and the U.S. being so dominant with culture, and before that the British Empire, that English is so dominant and pervasive everywhere you go that virtually, I mean, you can basically get around almost anywhere with just speaking English. The only place I actually had any trouble was in Japan.
Yes, that's true. There are not that many Japanese. China's different, though. Everybody in China is actively learning English these days.
Yeah.
But
But I kind of actually it was kind of one of the things that made it really endearing about Japan. I mean, the people were very friendly and wanted to
very,
help communicate, but we had language was just there's no chance, so it was a lot of gesticulations and pointing and things like that. But it also made it feel just exotic in a way that no other country could possibly feel.
yeah, yeah, I really do like Japan. I'd like to spend more time there. Actually, I'll never forget one time in just a ordinary one step above a coffee shop restaurant. My wife and I went there, and it was the first trip we'd taken there together. And we left a tip on the table. And so we walked out, paid the bill, walked out, left the money on the table. And we're halfway down the block. And the waitress comes running after us. She's worried. And she says, here, you left it. It was her tip. That she was afraid we'd accidentally left money on the table.
It's amazing.
Right.
And yeah, that's an amazing place. I really like it. But as far as freedom goes, though, today, is it different now? Especially, we know that there are places that are, the health departments have decided they're less interested in having Americans there. So it's, they just from the passport, just traveling there is difficult. I just wonder, is there a place if you could only pick one or two countries, I know in the past it was for you, New Zealand was one of them that, you thought was a great place to be where you'd be left alone, unmolested, and you get a lot of beautiful things about it. Is there one or two countries that you would recommend that people look at today?
Yeah, well, I covered all this stuff in that International Man book. And of course, the world has totally changed since then in many, many ways. But what would be my favorite country to go to today? If I was looking for, well, it depends on whether I just wanted a mellow lifestyle or whether I was looking for opportunity. Young opportunity, Africa.
Mellow lifestyle, more than mellow lifestyle, more like a mellow lifestyle, because we covered opportunity well, I think.
Yeah. Well, there it becomes a question of how much money you have. And I really still like Argentina, although it's being run by a criminally insane clique. And so Argentina's out for the next 4 or 5 years. From that point of view, probably. The U.S. has always been a great place to live. If you picked a small town, nice town, like a town that's like Aspen, but without the giant prices on the right side of the menu, you can actually do pretty well inside the U.S. Pick one of these mid-sized towns in Wyoming, like Cody or Sheridan or Jackson Hole. Well, that's too much like Aspen, frankly. So you can still do this within the U.S. if you pick the right state. But what country would I look at? Well, there's a list of 100 and say over 200 for practical purposes. So where would I go? I'm in Uruguay right now, which is small, which is nice. 3.5 million people, mostly farmland. What they do, everybody here grows trees or soybeans or cows. That's what they do in this country. It's a socialist country. Well, not really socialist because the government doesn't own much, but it's a welfare state, one of the first in the world. But it's mellow. They leave you alone. I like it. So, but things can change. I mean, for all I know, these idiots, look, even in Uruguay, which is not a bad choice. In Latin America, excellent choice, I think. It's got beaches. And it's nice. It's got Punta del Este, which is a very jet-setty place, very sophisticated. So what could change here in Uruguay? Look, 5 or 6 years ago, these people had a plebiscite. I'm not talking about the Congress or the Parliament passed a law. There was a plebiscite where everybody voted as to whether they should have an income tax. And they voted in an income tax on themselves. So how degraded is that? So, no place is really safe. It's what you've got to have is 2 or 3 alternatives, so that when one gets bad, you can go to the other, and you've got, your friends and your opportunities. I know a lot of people listening to this will say, "Oh, that's impossible," but it's not impossible. It's just a question of how bold and innovative you are. You don't need money.
I think that's right. I think, Doug, I don't know if I've told you, but number 3 on my backup plan is putting up a little tent on your property there in Uruguay. So I'm just being bold and telling you.
Oh no, you'd be more than welcome. Things really get bad. I've got 1,000 acres here with about a mile of riverfront. Leads to the ocean about 15 minutes away. So, we could subdivide it and nobody'd bother us, actually. Yeah. It's one of the nice things about this country in particular, but you my God.
I think everyone has to have some backup plans. Yeah.
Say again?
I was just saying, yeah, everyone has to have some backup plans, whether it's, friends and family out of state, just to give you some out of an urban area backup, or, it's renting or buying a small apartment in, someplace in Costa Rica or something like that. I think it is important for people to think like that. Obviously, people probably wish that they'd been thinking about it for the last decade or more, but I think that it just because it feels like it's too late, it almost never actually is too late. And if the excuse for not acting is because it feels like it's too late, I think it's a terrible mistake. I think it's a terrible mental mistake people make.
But it is going to get harder because as this economic crisis that we're still in the early stages of actually gets worse, one of the things that I think the US government is going to do is put on some kind of foreign exchange controls so that unpatriotic people can't get out and take their assets with them. They may not care if you leave, but it's going to be hard to get your assets out of the country. It's like South Africans now. If you're a white person or a black person, it doesn't matter that from that point of view, in South Africa, and you want to get the hell out, and I would get the hell out of South Africa. That is an exception in Africa. That's a country where I think there's very little opportunity for reasons we could talk about at length. You can't. How are you going to get your money out? You can't transfer it out. Yeah, maybe you can buy some gold coins and put them on your person and hope that, you know, you're not inspected as you get on the plane. Or maybe you can buy a sailboat, an expensive sailboat, and do that, but it's very inconvenient. So we could have that in the US, foreign exchange controls. Argentines right now, if they don't have money out of the country, maybe they can get out, but they can't get their money out of the country. So you should be planning ahead. Americans should be, because we will get foreign exchange controls. And we did have in the past mild foreign exchange controls under Nixon. People have forgotten that. So they'll make a comeback, especially if we get a left-wing president, which is, we discussed earlier. I think the odds favor a left-wing president, if not this time, the next time. And if we have a war with China, which seems to be building up, actually, you know, you're really going to want to have an alternative where you're kind of out of harm's way. So it all adds up to me.
Well, let's maybe next time we can talk about this foreign exchange controls, because I think, you know, we spent this time talking mostly about where one could physically put themselves in different countries for things. But I think understanding how foreign exchange controls work, the places that have them, and the real limits that it puts on the people that live in those areas. You know, and I know you have lots of stories about that yourself, and trying to move capital in and out of buying property in Argentina, for instance, and things like that. How difficult these things can be, and I think that'd make a good topic for maybe tomorrow.
Yeah, that sounds very good, Matt. So talk to you then.
All right, thanks, Doug. Appreciate it.